Hey everybody, this is Denise at Nuddles. I am here to show you how to keep your quilt square on your frame as you're quilting on your long arm. So I'm here with the Bernina Q24 and I have a quilt loaded on the frame. It's just floating, and that's how I prefer to quilt my quilt, is with them just floated as opposed to the quilt top being pinned onto one of the leaders. So I've kind of done a little bit of prep work beforehand. I'm going to move this out of the way so you can see a little bit better in here. This particular machine has a laser light. I hope you can see that in there. So the laser light is shining down right at the needle point. Maybe you don't have that. Maybe you just have a channel lock that you can put on. Basically what I want to do is I want to run the machine straight across on that horizontal plane. And when I do that, I'm going to line up my quilt top with that so it's horizontal, because my rails are horizontal obviously, so I want to make sure that the quilt top is nice and parallel and straight and even in relation to the leaders, the rails. So if you'll notice, I put a pin in right at the corner. I'm keeping my top nice and smooth. I've just worked my way across and I've just pinned all the way across so my quilt top is nice and straight and even, okay? Then the next thing that we have to talk about is the quilt top itself not going crooked, because I think a lot of times people think it's shifting off to the side. So I need to make sure that my quilt stays straight as I quilt. So what I do to do that, first of all, I've measured edge to edge of my quilt through the middle. So I've measured through the middle of the quilt here, and I've gotten my dimension. And then I double check that the end of the quilt, the borders, are the same dimension. Sometimes the borders tend to flag out a little bit, so I need to make sure that the dimension of the width up on the top and the dimension of the width throughout the middle and the other end are consistent. So they are. I've pinned the top. The next thing that I do is I actually utilize my leader, which the job of this leader is for the quilt top, but I'm not using it for that because I float my top. So what I'm going to do with this is put my foot back on. I bring this leader all the way up to the top, nice and straight. I could roll down the top of my quilt a little bit if I need to, since I'm a few inches off from the edge. But what I do here is I take another pin and I pin this right into the leader where the edge of the quilt lives. So I'm going to put this pin right in here so that it's marking the edge of the quilt, which is even with the top. Okay? And that pin stays in the leader. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, so the pin is lined up right with the edge of the quilt. And then I need to make sure that as I work my way down the quilt, I'm just rolling up the leader. So as I work my way down the quilt, I need to make sure that the edge of the quilt is still lined up with the leader. Here it is. And I'll put a pin right here. I personally don't like to baste with the machine. I don't know, I just like to use the pins. For me, I feel like I have really good control over that. Let's look at the other side. So on this side, it's a hair in. I need to scoot my quilt just a hair, and that's okay. So just scoot that quilt over here and put a pin there. So I'm pretty confident that now my quilt, I'm fairly confident that my quilt top is square, at least from here to here, okay? Now, this is a pretty small quilt. Let's say your quilt is humongous. Let's say it's a king size quilt. Just basing your squareness off of the outer edge of the outer part of your quilt may not be enough. Maybe you need to find some reference point. Like there's a seam that goes right down the center of my quilt. Maybe I need to find some reference point throughout the middle of the quilt, or maybe it needs to be at the borders. Whatever other reference points you feel like you need to have. So for me, okay, I'll put a pin right here which references that seam going down the middle of the quilt. As I work my way down the quilt, I can check that reference point and make sure that even the middle of my quilt hasn't shifted. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to quilt my first pass, and I'll come back to you after I've done that and advance the quilt so I can show you how I continue to keep the quilt square throughout the quilt. Okay, so I've quilted the first pass of my quilt, I've advanced the quilt, and my quilt top, since it's floating, kind of just sags or goes in whichever direction it wants to go in. But now what I need to do is make sure that it is perfectly straight throughout the whole entire quilt. So if you remember earlier, we put pins in our leader to gauge that end point. Something that happens too when we quilt, especially if it's really dense quilting, it makes it a little bit tighter. So if we didn't use this method, our quilt would keep coming in, or it would be skewing off to the side. So the way we're doing it, we're going to make sure that the quilt top is perfectly lined up, consistent with the backing the whole time. So I've pulled my leader up here, and I need to shimmy my quilt a little bit to make that edge of my quilt line up with the pin exactly the way it did up at the top. So now it lines up perfect. I'm going to grab a pin and pin it right here in the lower portion of my quilt. And then I'm going to come, ouch, to the other edge of my quilt and check that. Make sure your leader is not skewed when you use it as a guide. And there are other methods that you can use. I know some people like to take a ruler and line it up right inside the rail or something like that. I like using the leader. So if you notice here, the border is just a little inside. So I've got 45 inches worth of fabric that I can use to kind of scoot this over. And now I'm lined up, and now I'm going to pin through all 3 layers. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned maybe this quilt was really large. I can double check that the center reference point of the center of my quilt is lined up with that center pin, and I'm really happy with that. So I feel very confident, and I hope you do too, that this quilt top is now perfectly lined up and straight and will stay square throughout the whole process. I'm gonna just keep doing that exact same process throughout the entire quilting process, and by the time I get to the bottom, the quilt should be perfectly square. So I hope that worked. If you have questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.